Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Highly Inspired. I'm Ella.
And I'm Jordan.
Hey, guys. This week we are going to be talking about a few people that kind of died shortly after either speaking out against institutional power or certain governments or the UN. But before we dive into that topic, Jordan and I have an announcement that we want to make. Jordan, do you want to kick it off?
Yes. So, guys, we have a Kickstarter campaign launching in a couple of days, and this episode will be out before that, but the date that it will be published is February 9th. So look out for that. We will be publishing links and updating on our other social media platforms, Instagram, just with other updates. But we would really love for you to check it out. We have worked hard on producing a trailer video for it that kind of highlights our overall brand and just our journey through starting the podcast leading up till now and where we're hoping to take it. And we put a lot of love and energy into it. So
Yes.
we're really excited.
Especially if you're curious about our journey, if you're maybe a newer listener or just are curious about like more background on why Jordan and I started the podcast, what our values are, and what we want to do in the future to grow it. Definitely watch the video, like and comment on that, and then also check out the Kickstarter like Jordan said. And if you feel compelled to donate to our campaign, we have some great fun prizes that come along with that. So so stay tuned. But let's dive into this episode. So yeah, this is
Where
kind
to
of
start?
been a heavy research topic for sure. I think the idea to kind of get into this topic started when I saw an Instagram story actually about a segment of this leader of Libya named Gaddafi, and it was a portion of his speech talking about how he's addressing the UN in 2009. And previous to seeing this, I had never heard of this person. I didn't know that much about Libya, the history of it, whatnot. And the snippet of his speech that I saw was him calling out Western countries, and it was specifically about the H1N1 flu and kind of making a dig that was this a man-made virus. And it was kind of, the person who posted it was paralleling that to kind of what we've been dealing with the COVID situation. But so that was kind of where my initial exposure to him came from. And then I showed it to Jordan and we both listened to his full UN speech transcript, which was about an hour and a half long. And he pretty much was kind of just taking kind of a diplomatic speech at Western countries or countries that have kind of the veto power in the UN and have are kind of considered the global countries of the UN and have the most power, whereas like smaller countries that might not have nuclear weapons or their currency might not be super strong or well used, they don't have as much say in the UN. And he was kind of saying we need to like equalize that and give smaller countries more of a say. And so that was kind of like super high level what his speech was. And then that kind of made us dive into like, okay, who is this guy? Like, what did he do in Libya? And then we found out that he died shortly after giving this speech. And
he had a brutal death.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most barbaric stories of a death I've heard of. I don't know all of the specifics, and I think a lot of the facts surrounding that are a little bit buried, and I'm sure there's been some misconstrued information regarding that. But we have found out some information about him, and I think that it is important to sort of explain his background and how he came to power. Basically, I think he was in the military of sorts and then binded with some other Egyptian, I guess you could say, rebels. And they started this free unionist officers movement, which was a whole campaign and whole activism process of overthrowing King Idris, who was in power at the time. And King Idris, known by all of the Libyan people was apparently deeply corrupt and was highly involved with Western interests. So I guess at face value, you could say that he wasn't interested in the Libyan people. He wasn't focused on internal factors.
Issues,
It was
yeah.
all external. And so I would assume that Gaddafi became passionate about that because he wanted to, turn that around and bring more of the efforts more within Libyan borders. And so I think that is what started his whole process of becoming in power. I'm not exactly sure how the Free Unionist Officers movement transpired into him becoming a colonel, but he became a colonel, and then and then somehow he became a dictator, or a de facto leader, which it was a dictator. But
yeah, and he definitely had. We're not necessarily endorsing like all of the ways that he governed, and obviously, like a dictatorship is definitely a different form of government than we're used to, kind of in the U.S. However, I think that now that over this past year and a half, Jordan and I have really studied U.S. history from kind of a more global perspective that you aren't necessarily taught in school. And you kind of see, even though the U.S. has great values and our Constitution, I think has very pure intentions and is a very beautiful piece of work, our government doesn't always like honor our Constitution. And when we are dealing with international affairs, we tend to kind of be the global leader and kind of want to kind of boss smaller countries around, use their resources, even though we have tons of resources here to use. And I think that to other countries, that is kind of a point of concern. And I think that other countries and other leaders don't want to be told
it's a threat.
It's a threat. And they, especially, it's like, okay, no one got involved in, when we went through our civil war, no one got involved in it. Like, we fought it out, and ultimately the right team ended up winning, but it could have gone the other way. So I think that Libya is an example where maybe some of Gaddafi's strategies of being kind of more socialist might sound foreign to us, but I think that he was trying to kind of lift Libya out of poverty, and he tried to make education and healthcare free for all Libyans. He tried to, he planted over 40 million trees and built the largest irrigation system that they had there.
Yeah, they had a tax-free system.
Yeah, he tried to nationalize banks there. So I think that he was trying to progress Libya, and I think that he did progress it a lot from the monarchy, which obviously you're already not really starting from a good place if you're starting from a monarchy where the wealth is already centralized. But I think the biggest question for Jordan and I, we were like, even just a few hours ago, we were like, okay, why did the U.S. start bombing Libya? And then why did this like rebel force ultimately kill Gaddafi? And then why was NATO involved? Like, we were trying to figure out like what was pissing NATO and the US off. Like, there has to be a reason.
At this point in time, we were involved with NATO.
Yeah.
And then shortly after, when Trump became elected, we
kind of distanced ourselves
from NATO. Now we're back in NATO at this current date.
And I don't even know why. I feel like NATO is not even a good thing when you really think about it. It seems to kind of weaken our power as a country, but that's kind of a whole nother conversation.
It's cliquey. Like, why do we need to be only joining forces with certain countries, and what are those agendas?
Yeah,
it's different than the UN. It's different than,
it's not a government. It's not something we vote on. We don't vote on what NATO gets to do. We don't vote on the people that make those decisions.
Yeah, and who are these officials that are actually involved with these meetings and these
And it allows
plans.
us to do wars without kind of getting Congress fully involved, which the whole point, like, Congress is supposed to declare war, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing. But basically, like, we had these questions like, why did this happen? And we found out that prior to Gaddafi's death, not only did he give this UN speech that probably caused a lot of countries in power to be concerned and frustrated and kind of scared that such a challenging message to Western countries was getting out. But the fact that he had a huge oil economy there in the country, and he wanted to start requiring countries to pay in gold for the oil in Libya, which once Jordan and I heard that, it all started to click because as you had researched, the oil, the gold standard is something that we no longer have with our currency.
Yeah, FDR, I don't know if the word abolish fits with this, but we moved away from the gold standard in 1933. And so I would assume that we were probably one of the first major countries to do that. I don't know if we were the first, but back in 1971, there was this whole resurfacing of questioning the gold standard and contemplating whether we needed to reinstitute it again because we were seeing a rise in inflation. And I think everyone was confused. Why are we seeing this inflation? And so President Nixon took that as an opportunity to sort of create this campaign and try to influence other countries to like globally move away from
so that we
having
all could
gold-backed currency
on the same page.
Exactly.
And we wouldn't be the only ones to fall.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if something were to happen, like say a small country figuring out how to gyp the system by requiring gold so that they could obtain more gold, well, then they wouldn't even be able to do that because no other country is valuing gold anymore.
Yeah.
So, it's really interesting. And now we've just learned through some research that no countries currently are backed by gold.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I don't know if that'll change, but yeah, I think that whole situation in the 1970s changed a lot. And
then
I
officially
think
ended in 73, right?
in 73, yeah.
Okay.
Within 2 years, we totally got rid of it.
Yeah. So you could see why like the US and by extension NATO was really upset when they heard that Gaddafi wanted us to have to pay with gold instead of the US dollar. And basically like we realized that what would happen is that basically like the US dollar would tank, and this kind of exposed Western countries and also the euro and other places that weren't backed by the gold standard that really our currency is kind of like a false sense. Like
it's empty.
It's empty, and it showed our weak point.
It's a fiat currency. It's just printed. It isn't backed by a material good or elemental good. And so that's why inflation can never be controlled, because there's no set amount that it's connected to. It's just sort of infinite. Like you can print more. If money is lost, you can print more.
Yeah.
And so that's why there's no confines.
Yeah. And this is, so shortly after this was when the no-fly zone over Libya was approved by the UN. And then the USA and NATO quickly went beyond its mandate. And that was when you started having those jets, kind of the air fighting going on. And then shortly after that,
the convoy, right?
Yeah, something like that. And then you started having the rebel forces in Libya kind of gain traction, which some people have been kind of suspicious. Okay, where did those rebel forces get funding? And those were the forces that ultimately captured Gaddafi and kind of murdered him.
Yeah, brutally murdered him. Yeah.
So it's very interesting.
And in a country like that had just only recently started to like get footing economically, do you think that they had additional funding to be putting towards something like that? Or materials, access to materials, access to weaponry to,
I don't know,
conduct I guess you could call it a hijacking in a way, an ambush.
Yeah.
I am not perfect on that terminology, but Gaddafi's death was brutal. It was said in a few articles that he was dragged
through the streets,
out of a pipe of a building through the streets and tortured to death.
Yeah.
So you can imagine what that how that would look from like a public witness perspective. It was probably a bloodbath.
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like that's everything that we wanted to cover with him. I definitely recommend checking out his UN speech, just kind of looking into his story. It's definitely not something that you learn in a typical education setting. And I do think it's really interesting that he brought up the Western pharmaceuticals point, just to circle back to that, because I do think that is something that we're dealing with right now. And that has been kind of...
That was the swine flu, right? H1N1?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure.
I think it was.
Which is interesting because a lot of people think
because that was around Obama's first term and the Benghazi crisis. And I'm pretty sure that was when the swine flu was.
And I think that ideally they would have wanted the swine flu to had taken off that fear factor that COVID-19 had, but unfortunately that name wasn't scary enough and we didn't have social media, so it wasn't as invasive for people to be like totally in that lockdown. But when you look at the statistics of it, actually the swine flu was way more deadly to kids than
you bring up a great point
COVID.
About the social media.
Yeah,
I think that they needed the technology. We needed to have the technology in order for the proper marketing
for COVID.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that it's been cool to see that kind of the US's awakening, and especially on the conservative right side, because they kind of used to give, I think, Big Pharma a bigger pass, and now that's kind of flopped with the parties. But I think this awakening to Big Pharma, to children's vaccine schedules being really intensive, to just the food that we eat and the metals that are in our bodies, and all the long-term illnesses that people have, and the normalization of that. And I think for him to call that out 10 years earlier, and then now for so many people to be awakened by that.
Hard hitting.
And I think you said this, that once people figure out the health stuff, everything else, it's just a matter of time. Because once you realize that you've been lied to about your health, then you're going to realize, what else have they been lying to me about?
Yeah.
And I think that
and then once you realize what you need to extract from your lifestyle and what you put in your body and the foods you eat and etc., then you will in turn be healthier, have a healthier body, healthier mind, and then can start to perceive the world in like a totally different way
and see patterns and be like, why are we like this? Are like, I think if COVID happened, would people be so against us going into the Ukraine? I don't think so. I think that we would be a little bit more, I think that because we've gone through something like so intense, we're just very like overly skeptical, which I think is good, which kind of brings us into...
I just want to say one last thing about Gaddafi. I think that this example of him and his death is really interesting because this is someone who, say for us personally, we probably might not have supported all of his policies. Like if he were a leader here, a politician here, we probably wouldn't have. But it isn't about that. It's about no matter what his policies were that got him into power and kept him in power, it was what he did with calling out the institution like corruption that like predecessed him, that allowed him to sort of resonate with all the Libyan people that he did, because it just was like a complete shift. And I think that our discussion here of talking about all these people that had different methodologies of calling out institutional power totally went at it in different ways, individualized ways. I just
that's great. I'm glad you added that. So the next person we want to talk about is obviously more domestic, and as U.S. citizens, we know who this person is, and that's JFK. There's a lot to discuss, but obviously a lot of people know JFK was the youngest president. He was elected in the 60s, right? And he was murdered and assassinated in his first term as president.
He didn't finish it.
No.
He was only 46 years old. He was inaugurated at 43, which made him the youngest elected American president to date, actually. I think that we had one that was somehow... there was someone
Obama
that was
younger?
younger than him. No, Obama wasn't.
Okay.
There was a president before JFK that was... like, what's it called when you are like a vice president and then...
Taken.
Yeah, like he was sworn in after like a president was...
Yeah, but he wasn't elected.
Wasn't elected, but he was the youngest elected main president.
Okay.
And so, yeah, and he was also the first Catholic president we've ever had.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Oliver Stone just released a documentary about JFK, and I watched it 2 weeks ago, and it's 2 hours. It's on Showtime. There's going to be a 4-hour version that's released at the end of the month, I think.
Really?
Over all platforms.
Ooh.
But it's really good, and it kind of factually outlines everything that he was doing as president that was very different than like all of his predecessors, both Republican and Democrat. He really had truly progressive ideas, and he wanted America to really reflect what our founding fathers wanted. And I think this was something that I didn't really realize. I kind of thought JFK was just like a Democrat, and like
I kind of thought he was an industry plant.
Yeah.
Like he was somehow just like conjured up and like concocted. He was this star, this celebrity-like looking,
like
handsome,
I never really looked into his policies.
Exactly. I kind
Yeah.
of thought he was just like surface level.
Yeah, but his policies, I mean, like if he was president now, I mean, people would go crazy just based off his policies. It was very isolationist. He didn't want us involved really in other countries' affairs. He wanted to
He was pretty anti-war.
He was anti-war. He wanted to decrease the size of the CIA by 20 to 30%.
Gosh, we need that.
Is crazy. He actively went against different proposals of assassinations of other leaders. There was an instance with the Cuban, kind of around the Cuban missile crisis, but basically the intelligence came to him and they were like, can we do a fake terrorist attack with a plane getting blown up? Sounds familiar, huh?
Yeah.
And can we like blame it on Cuba, and that way we have like an excuse to go to war with Cuba? And he was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So obviously that pissed him off, or pissed them off. And I don't know, there was just a lot of other things that
He
kind of were
rebelled.
happening.
He challenged them.
Yeah.
He was for pulling us out of the Vietnam War. I don't know if he ever actually ended up getting to do that because he died so quickly after announcing that. But yeah, even those little challenging moments where he didn't want to, agree to these subversion strategies solely for like the optics like that we could give to the public. Like really, what's the point of that? To go to war with Cuba? It would only be for the optics of it.
Yeah. No, and there was a few other things. So the other clashes with the CIA, besides like the Cuba thing, was that so the French ambassador came to him and said there's just a plot to assassinate the president of France. And he came to JFK and he's like, what are you going to do about this? And JFK literally said he was not involved and that he had no control over the CIA. So this was the first time, and I don't think ever since then that a president has publicly said to an ambassador, I have no control over the CIA. So this showing that even in the 60s, that the president, who is supposed to be commander-in-chief of the military of our country, has no control over this huge intelligence agency that interferes with global affairs.
Yeah.
Like, that's insane.
How scary would that be to the public to hear that your commander-in-chief has no control over a specific agency?
It's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's too hard hitting for regular people to digest, which is why I get why that was such a red flag to them. And that was probably a big lesson to all all ongoing administrations that are involved with the presidency. It's probably like in the handbook, like you can't say stuff like that because of this.
Yeah.
Because that just was so alarming.
Yeah. So Jordan and I kind of did the same thing that we did with other people, but we were trying to figure out, okay, like who would have benefited from his death? Like who are the parties at play besides the CIA that kind of would feel like him dying would be convenient? And I think that we kind of came up with the military industrial complex. So any war manufacturers that kind of reap benefits from that. And this was something Dwight Eisenhower, who was the president previous to JFK, was the president that gave the farewell speech that said, beware of the military industrial complex, because we were just coming out of World War II, which had stimulated our economy that had tanked because of the Great Depression, probably also because the gold standard was disappearing, right?
I think it was more so that.
Then, the other stuff. And then, okay, so that's all happening. And then we're realizing, okay, the only way potentially for the U.S. to prosper is if we're like having wars. Like that's like now become a huge part of our industry. And like, how do you give that up once it's become routine?
Yeah, it's probably even scary to think about. If we don't have this there, how will our economy change?
And the budget has never been scaled back, the military budget. And this isn't just like the military budget that we have for defense, like keeping up our machinery and stuff. This is just like also active forces that like are more offensive, and it hasn't decreased since World War II. It kind of briefly stifled in the 80s under Reagan, but like pretty much that's always gone up. So you have a president in the 60s that's trying to put an end to that. Obviously that's going to piss them off. The CIA, we already talked about that. Wall Street, I think millionaires and billionaires probably were upset with him.
Well, think of all of the, like going back to the Industrial Revolution, think of how many massive monopolies and massive, manufacturing companies emerged because of that era. Well, I would assume a ton of, weapons manufacturers and metals manufacturers for weapons, like so many massive businesses that were vital to the economy at the time and probably employed a ton of people. Yeah. Like if they don't have wars to be making weapons for, then all of those jobs are going to be lost. And it was probably, it would have been detrimental, but still, like, what's the greater benefit? Yeah. Like going to war and allowing Americans to die, or it's a double-edged sword for sure.
And then the last thing we came up with was the media companies, which, surprise, surprise, this is the pimps of the politicians that were kind of in bed with the powerful elites that wanted to drive a certain narrative. So these are all the same players that we saw Trump kind of struggle with, or other presidents, and definitely something had to happen to Kennedy, I think, to kind of send a message like, okay, like you don't play with these forces like that are basically the fourth branch of government.
Like, who are you? You're just this young politician. Yeah, people love you, but you don't know anything. Like, we're here to like put you in place.
Yeah.
I think that was the tone that they as in our institutions and these agencies like the CIA, FBI wanted to set and wanted to make clear to everyone.
Yeah.
But his death is just so interesting though, because so I know like most people are familiar with Lee Harvey Oswald, who was the initial shooter who shot JFK.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just one shot. It was a multitude of shots. I believe it was 3.
According to the Warren report, which was the investigative report done by the government.
And he didn't die on the spot. He was rushed to the hospital and died in the hospital because I guess his heart was still beating. And the shot that really created the fatal blow was he had a shot to the head and it blew out a part of his skull that wouldn't have been repairable.
Yeah.
So it's tragic. It was a horrible way to die. But what I think people forget though is that there was another shooter, and this I think was just a couple days after, Jack Ruby, I believe his name was, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. So
Which
we have
is
this
crazy.
assassinator who assassinates JFK, and then another assassinator who assassinates the assassinator of JFK.
Yeah, very interesting.
So where did this person come out of, the woodworks?
Yeah.
And what are the odds of that? Seriously. And apparently that shot to Lee Harvey Oswald happened while he was in jail, while he was being held.
Really?
They hadn't released him.
When he was walking out of jail. But I could be wrong.
Okay, but exactly.
Yeah.
On jail grounds.
Yeah, he was already arrested at this point.
Yeah. So they hadn't let him. I mean, there's no way they would have let him go free after that. Even
Well, I
while
don't know if he had been. I thought it was when he was walking out of a courthouse or something, but I don't know for sure. But I do know that. So in Oliver Stone's documentary, he goes through 5 different issues with the Warren Report. Number 1, the so-called 3 bullets and the magic bullet. So a lot of people will say, okay, if it was only going to be one person that shot JFK, it couldn't be too many rounds of bullets because that wouldn't have made sense. So it only could be 3. But the problem was there was so many wounds that it didn't make sense for only 3 bullets at the same time. So then they came up with this theory called the magic bullet theory, where basically the bullet went through the zigzag passage and hit 2 men, and I think caused 7 wounds. So they said that one bullet, the magic bullet, caused 7 wounds and hit 2 men. So that was the narrative. And so I think that was something that people were kind of okay, what does that
What are the
mean?
physics of that?
It was
I think
it was
that's
hitting
physically
the
impossible.
car and the mirror. It was and it went straight through. And they also
But it can't.
said,
Bullets go through metals like
Yeah.
that. It's even if the narrative was saying if it was hitting a car door, that's how it was ricocheting and go through all these bodies. I don't think that that's physically possible.
Well, also what they said is that the bullet that they have pictures of in archives and stuff is in pristine condition. And experts say that if a bullet did go through that many wounds, it would have been smashed at the top. So that's also something that is a question mark. And then the second thing was that about the rifle. So the rifle that Lee Oswald had, the picture didn't match the rifle that they acquired after the scene of the crime. There was slight differences.
And the one at the scene of the crime is the one that should be
the official.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a question. There was also new evidence that he might not have been on the 6th floor of the building that he shot from. And then there was also the autopsy where there was fake photographs and there was pressure placed on the Parkland hospital doctors to change what they saw with their own eyes. And then the 4th thing was just Oswald's history of working with the CIA and the FBI. And I don't know if you came across any of that in your research. Yeah. So he kind of
That's a scary backstory.
he had a lot of history with
the CIA and FBI.
Yeah, and he was involved in cover-ups. And when he was originally detained, he kept saying, I'm a patsy, I'm a patsy, I'm a patsy. So that also never really fully got sorted out. And then kind of the 5th point that Oliver Stone brings up is, why was Kennedy murdered? And we kind of talked about that. We talked about the things that were going on at the time that could have led to potentially there being a motive,
No, there was definitely a motive, whether it was seen by the public the same way as, say, the FBI or CIA or government officials. Those are probably different. But yeah, he was a different type of president than we had ever seen before. And I think that he was seen as a threat to to, these
Institutions.
institutions because he did things in such a different way and clearly was loved and admired and was so young, and this was only his first term. He could have served many more years, and clearly he got a lot done in the short time that he was in the presidency. So I think that all of that compiled just to emphasize his threatening perception to them.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Do you want to talk about briefly with Robert Kennedy?
Yeah, so when we were just researching JFK, I kind of realized, wait a minute, Robert Kennedy, brother of JFK, also was assassinated. I feel like I have not heard about this enough. I mean, obviously I learned about it a bit when I was younger in history class, but like, wouldn't you agree this is kind of something that we forget about?
Yeah.
Like, we all kind of talk about JFK, but forget about Robert Kennedy, who probably would have become president of the United States, because how he was assassinated was the night that he won the Democratic National, so he was running for a Democratic, whatever.
Primary?
Yeah, in the Democratic primary, he won the state of California. And so,
which is a huge deal.
Which is basically like the deal.
Yeah.
Because California is such a big it dictates a lot for them. And so that the night after he won, he was assassinated. And basically everyone concludes that since he won California, he probably would have won the Democratic nomination. So and then he probably would have been a huge candidate up against Nixon, who I think was who he would be running against. But yeah, it's really interesting. I don't know why the Kennedys had two major deaths like that in their family within such a short amount of time, but it's very sad, and the odds once again are just astronomically hard to wrap your head around. But yeah, we got to show Bobby Kennedy some love, because I hope we can look into that more, and I will definitely keep my eyes peeled for more information.
We might do a round 2 of this at some point with some of
There's
the people.
Probably so
There's
many.
so many people like this that we could talk about forever.
I totally agree.
But it's crazy. Like, his son, Robert Kennedy Jr., is one of the biggest people that has been speaking out against the mandates. And I mean, he just published that whole book against Fauci with all that citation. I mean, that family definitely has, even though there definitely were personal faults with Bobby and JFK in terms of their affairs, whatever, but in terms of their policies and what they wanted for America, you can tell that their family was strong and
very passionate.
And very passionate. And something that Robert Kennedy Jr. brought up was that at the end of the Robert Stone documentary, he talks about, if you go anywhere internationally, you will see JFK Airport, JFK statues, JFK Hospital, like internationally, and no other president had that impact on the world. Mm-hmm. So it really proves that this was someone who was giving a new vision of America, where we weren't going to be involved in everyone's affairs. We were just going to be in the background and just be focused on ourselves.
Keep things within our borders.
Yeah.
Take us out of war.
Yeah.
Just build here, get us out of all of the financial repercussions of World War II and improving inflation. Like, I think that he had good intentions, but you're right. He had a huge impact globally.
Yeah. And then the next person that we want to talk about is Patrice, what's his,
Lumumba.
So the reason why I wanted to bring up him after JFK was because, so Patrice, he was the leader of the Free State of the Congo for a very brief period of time. And JFK really admired him and really liked what he was doing for the Congo. And I think even made a reference to him in one of his speeches. And was devastated when he found out that he was assassinated. And this was another person who, really was anti-imperialism and was a grassroots political figure and was pro-Africa and African independence. And I knew nothing about the Congo before this. And if it hadn't been for that being mentioned with the JFK stuff, I don't know if I would have researched this at all.
Yeah, no, I mean, he was, when you say grassroots political figure, he rose to the ranks in the most natural and organic way that you possibly could. He started out as, I believe, a president of like some committee, and then
Yeah.
rose to being like a
And he
senator
got elected,
and was elected. Yep.
90% of the vote.
Exactly. So he didn't just come out of nowhere. He had no ties to any elites that may have been in the Congo prior. And so it was, he did it ethically
Yeah.
and morally. And he had a roller coaster of events with being arrested,
Yeah.
and he served 12 months in prison in a Belgium prison.
Yeah, so Belgium.
And then he was released, and then he got like arrested again, and then served. So he was put through it.
Yeah. And so the Congo was occupied by Belgium, and the main ruler was this king, the king of Belgium in the 1850s.
Leopold. I believe King Leopold.
Yes. And Leopold, I did not know this, but he facilitated a genocide of 5 to 10 million people in the Congo.
What?
And no, I'm not even kidding.
Wait, what?
Yes. Yes. So under Belgium, 5 to 10 million people, potentially more, died in the Congo during the 19th century. And
dude, that's more than the entire Holocaust.
it's about so the Holocaust is 6 to 11 ish. So it's about
the same.
And no one ever talks about this. I've never heard of this.
I have never heard of this.
And what's crazy is that
I'm not smiling because this is something happy to be talking about. It's just mind blowing and honestly pathetic that we have not been taught this.
No.
That this is not spoken of. This isn't referenced. Wow. Okay. Sorry. I just interrupted.
No, it's crazy.
Just I'm showing my emotion to emphasize that.
Yeah. So obviously those people had gone through a lot. And I don't think that Belgium thought that there would be this natural leader to rise up and get 90% of the vote and overthrow the Belgians. Mm-hmm. And so then what happened was kind of when Patrice was gaining power and stuff, there was still troops in the Congo that were Belgian, and there was a lot of resources in the south of the Congo, and within those resources was a mineral that the U.S. used to create the atomic bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima. Now, mind you, this is the 60s with the Congo, and so the Cold War is happening between Soviet Russia and the U.S. And they have these minerals that could create atomic bombs. So the Congo becoming a free state is now becoming an issue. And there's all these troops that are still there that are foreign. And so Patrice goes to the UN and he says, will you help me out? They're not really respecting, I don't feel like my election is being respected. There's kind of still this tension. Mm-hmm. And the UN vetoed his request. So then he goes to the US and he goes, will you help me? The US does not.
Once again, going about it in the most ethical way possible.
France says no. So then, as a last resort, he goes to the Soviets. And that's when US and Belgium really started freaking out because they're like, we cannot let the Soviets get control of these resources. Because of the atomic bomb situation. And it was Eisenhower that had authorized the murder on the US side, but I don't think those plans got carried out because I think it ended up being the Belgians that were the main collaborators of his arrests.
Okay.
But he was really only in power for 9 months.
So was he arrested and then killed?
I think he was arrested once earlier on and then released, and then he was arrested and then killed again.
Okay.
Or not killed again, but yeah.
Killed again.
Yeah, so he was first arrested in 56 with charges of embezzlement, and this was when so he went to Belgium, and then when he came back to Belgium, they arrested him. So that was kind of sketchy.
And there were no grounds on the embezzlement charge.
I don't think
they said he was embezzling something for the post office, which I don't know what that has to do with anything, but yeah, clearly it wasn't something of tangibility that was worthy of him being arrested and imprisoned for 12 months.
Yeah, and then they kind of put in this like pseudo leader of the Congo who was African. His name started with an M. I don't remember off the top of my head, but he then became very friendly with the Western countries and kind of let them like walk all over the Congo. But Patrice really did want to, be kind of like he wanted to be independent, and they had the resources to do that. So
I think Lumumba and Gaddafi actually shared a bit in common, obviously contrasting their policies and their means of actually leading, but they kept things in their borders. It seemed like he was a positive
to other countries.
Yeah, he was a positive neutralist, which meant that he wanted to cooperate with other countries, but he was more focused on what they were doing within the Congo. So
okay, so
it wasn't actively hunting for conflict with the U.S. or hunting for conflict with the Soviets.
So just to clarify, this is how he ended up dying. So Mobuto, which was again that who became the new leader of the Congo, who was kind of backed by the Western countries. His forces were the ones that in early December detained them at a military camp, and then it was Lumumba and two of his associates were then transferred via an airplane, and then they were beaten during the flight. And then
my gosh.
Once I think, okay, so then once they landed, they were executed by a firing squad under Belgian supervision.
So it was Belgium.
Yeah, and then the bodies were thrown into shallow graves, and
heinous.
A government official later ordered the bodies to disappear.
And they probably did. They probably did, because it would have boosted their...
Yeah. So it's kind of like, again, that like rebel forces with the foreign power involved kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like if Belgium was the main chaperone of that whole thing, that they signed off on it, and that those were their people.
Yeah. So yeah, that's
horrible.
Crazy. I know. But that's
poor Lumumba.
R.I.P.
There's so many people that are just buried in our history, and obviously there's so much to learn, and we tend to focus on the main events and really dissect those, because there's no possible way every single human being can retain every component of history. Like, there's just too much, and especially in America, I think that we're so spoiled, and we've been so spoiled with having everything amazing here, that we kind of forget that there's this whole world of 200 plus other countries aside from us. So it's
craziness.
It's important to highlight these people that have been, like massive contributors to our global history, that just have kind of had their stories told wrongly, or just not justifiably.
Yeah, for sure.
So we saved the best for last.
Yeah, the fun one.
Honestly, I mean, it's fascinating. We are going to talk about Princess Diana and Princess Diana's death.
Yeah.
Most people are familiar with the story. Mm-hmm. When do you think was the first time you kind of delved into it or learned about it?
I feel like I don't remember a specific time, but I feel like it was just always a part of my childhood hearing about her. I know that one of my great aunts really loved her, especially when she lived in London, and like was very personally affected by her death. There was a lot of people in the 90s that felt a real attachment to her, kind of similar to JFK,
I kind of saw her as a beacon of hope, and were interested in her journey and what she did for
the people.
I mean, she was known as the people's princess. So yeah, when a death like that happens, and it's kind of a foggy explanation, and all the details are a bit confusing, and narratives are changing, and the series of events are being told in different ways that can make it even harder. And I think that that's what happened with her death, at least the event of it. It was, I mean, there are several different like strong explanations of it,
Yeah.
several different published explanations. So
Yeah, I think what's crazy is that when I was younger, like I honestly would see interviews of her and kind of like, oh, she's being a baby, like like she just wanted attention, blah blah. And I don't know, maybe
I kind of thought that too.
maybe part of that was there, but now as an adult and realizing, okay, she was 18 when she married Prince Charles, and he was in his 30s. Like, okay, yes, technically she was legally an adult, but I'm thinking of myself when I was 18, or looking at my younger sister, and I'm like, no way would we be able to like marry a prince, let alone someone that would be king, and
Exactly.
like have all that. I mean, how prevalent nowadays is depression in young women and eating disorders, let alone someone that's in this
yeah, we glorify
space.
it now, but at that time it destroyed her image, and they knew that it did, and the media continually surfaced these conversations of, oh, she's not mentally stable, she has eating disorders, she's given birth to two sons, she can't have another because she can't handle it, and all of these descriptions of her as being just crazy probably just fueled the fire that ended up hurting her even more mentally and emotionally, and ultimately her overall health. So,
and I think even though she eventually divorced and had other men that she was interested in, and I'm not exactly sure if she had, it seemed like she also had potentially affairs as well, but it's Prince, and even in her interview with the BCC or BBC, she says, I am 50% to blame for the marriage falling apart. So she did take ownership in that. However, when they married, I think she was naive to the situation, and she didn't realize that Prince Charles was still in love with
Camilla,
and never fell out of love with her, never really stopped fully seeing her. And so I think that was really detrimental, because how can you start a marriage on good footing when that is the foundation of the relationship? It starts with cheating. It doesn't even happen later on. It's pretty much
it was always there.
Yeah.
She said that it was like marrying, it was like a three-way marriage.
Yeah.
And that's sad. And the fact that she knew that so early on was probably extremely hard to go through. And also with the inclusion of them also having two sons, that probably just created more liability and more stress and angst, because it was kind of inescapable. Like she probably realized, I can't get out now because I'm not just married to this man. He's the father of my children.
Yeah, and this divorce had never happened in the royal family up until this point. I mean, if you go back in history to Princess,
there had been affairs, but not divorces.
Princess Margaret was denied, and she wasn't even part of the heir to the throne officially, but she was denied her first engagement because the man that she wanted to marry was previously divorced. And then prior to that, King Edward? I think King Edward, previous to Princess Elizabeth's father, who was the king, he abdicated the throne to marry a divorcee American. So you've had multiple instances where divorce was very, frowned upon, which is kind of why the marriage kept going for so long. And then finally, when the separation happened, something that Diana mentioned in her interview was that she suddenly didn't get any more protection from the royal family.
Yeah, the firm is the royal family.
It's the institution behind it. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really interesting, that once she was no longer technically married, that was when she lost protection.
She lost all the benefits.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't even just like...
This is very similar to the conversation of Harry and Meghan right now.
Yeah.
Like they're using similar language with since they've exited the firm or exited the royal family, they don't have that backing anymore. They don't have, the bodyguards and the security that they believe they deserve.
And she felt very exposed because she's still the mother of these kids. And now she's like, she said, I almost became the enemy of Prince Charles's staff because she was getting more media attention. And then I didn't realize that there was the causes that she was interested in, they didn't like her causes. They didn't like
Diana's causes.
They didn't like her causes, and they started blocking her flights.
They did?
Yeah.
Wow.
Out of the country is what she said, to go do her causes. And one of them that was very controversial was AIDS, which circles back to Fauci if you want to read Robert Kennedy Jr.'s.
Fauci's involved with everything.
No, if you want to read Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, it's very much well discussed. Everything's interconnected in this episode.
AIDS,
yeah. There's and that they were giving out a medicine to treat AIDS that actually was harming people. There was misinformation about that you could get AIDS from touching people, similar to COVID, that you could get COVID from surfaces, which they ended up disproving. So she went and did this charity work with people who had AIDS, and she shook someone's hand that had AIDS, and everyone freaked out. She wasn't wearing gloves.
I'm not laughing. That's so
because
funny,
she wasn't
though.
wearing gloves, and
God forbid she wasn't wearing gloves.
So again, it's that person that's willing to take on the medical misinformation that is used to keep especially the Western world in a constant state of fear and anxiety and like
she
stress.
probably knew exactly what she was doing too. She knew that.
Yeah.
That the narrative of the misinformation that if you touch people you could get AIDS. She probably knew that, but knew that she needed to, create something that would show the world like I'm gonna be fine, or that this is misinformation.
And that was a disease that people were very judgmental about because it was deemed the disease of the gays, and it was not people. It was not
very
nice.
stigmatized.
Yeah, people were not nice to people that had AIDS. So for her to be like, I don't care and I want to help these people was very progressive for that time, and definitely. The Queen was someone who usually liked charities for like corgis, and that's like very, very safe charities. No, I'm serious. I read this somewhere. I'm not even kidding.
The Queen puts all of her philanthropic work into corgi charities, and Diana's off like literally fighting the AIDS epidemic. Oh my gosh. No, but that's actually true.
And then another thing is right before she died, she called to stop international landmines, which do you know what a landmine is? I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up.
Well, no, actually, no, I don't.
So it's an explosive device concealed underground and designed to destroy or disable enemy targets, ranging from combative vehicles and tanks as they pass over or near. Such a device is typically automated by pressure when a target steps over it or drives it. So it's like a bomb that's like underground and explodes.
Secret, yeah, okay.
So she was trying to call for like an international ban on them because this was something that
which would have needed some sort of fleet to go in and actually remove them. Like, were there ones out?
I think in other countries it was a war tactic, and there were probably ones that were still there from old wars in certain countries. And so obviously again this goes back to the military industrial complex, and this was something, I don't know how significant this was in her like pissing off people, but I do think anytime that someone is calling for more peace than war, that is a problem for institutions, the firm. The British government is huge because then with military
just
funding.
Shuts down their operations. That's like what they live and breathe and do.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about her relationship with the man after Charles, the main one?
I don't know much about Dodi.
Okay.
I know that they never actually were able to marry because she passed away before they had their wedding, but they were engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And so I heard similar to how Camilla and Charles were sort of their, star-crossed lovers, like their first love that would have never been able to be taken out of the picture no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that Dodie was that for Diana too. Wasn't
I think
he
they met
someone
later in life, though,
Oh,
right?
okay. No, I thought that they had known each other somehow before.
I actually don't know.
But since she was so young when she met Charles, they never had like a formal relationship.
Interesting.
Um,
Well, so his father was the previous owner of Harold's, the huge department store.
yeah,
London.
it said he was worth $1.4 billion.
Yeah. So his father was very wealthy. His father was named Mohammed
Fayed.
Okay, Fayed.
We looked up that pronunciation.
Yeah,
by
I
the
wasn't
way.
paying attention.
He's
during that.
Egyptian. It's an Egyptian last name.
Yeah, so they're Egyptian. And so what's interesting about him is when Diana died, he was the one that was asking a ton of questions in court and wanted her death to be. What's the word? Do you know what the word is called when a death is deemed as an accident, but you still want an investigation to take place? There's a word for it.
I don't know the legal word for it.
Anyways, he was the one that really was calling for that to happen. And then when that did happen, he was the one who brought up a lot of questions about knowing. He was said that he knew for a fact that Diana was pregnant, that his son and her were going to announce their engagement soon. All this stuff that kind of, he said that people knew, but the public didn't know yet, and that were potential motives for her death. And then the facts of her death were that, it was a car accident. Originally, they said it was the paparazzi. Later on, they found out that the driver was drunk, and pretty much everyone died in the car except for her bodyguard survived. And then there was
Dodie wasn't with her?
No, he was.
He was with her.
Yeah, so he died as well. And then the white Fiat was kind of involved, and that was kind of the main point that killed them. And then there was a lot of weird things that happened, though. So there was a report that the original witness, or the first witness on the scene, the police would not listen to him and record his account of what happened.
Which is critical. Normally, police would be desperately wanting that. Any sort of firsthand witness testimony. That is massive. Why they would deny that, I don't understand. Probably because they didn't want it officiated and put into words that they couldn't destroy later on if needed.
Yeah. And then the other thing that was weird that he brought up was that she was not transferred to the nearest hospital. She was brought to a further one. And many people think that what she really died from was bleeding out to death. So if she had been maybe gone to a hospital faster, they could have done a blood transfusion. They could have stopped the bleeding. It wasn't like she died instantly. So that was also something that he brought up that was a question mark.
Well, since the driver of the original car that crashed died, they would have had to put her in some other vehicle in order to transport her to that. Yes. Yeah. So whoever was driving that ambulance, whoever was a part of that team. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's so scary.
Yeah. And then they also said that potentially the blood that was used to say the alcohol of the driver was really high, that blood didn't match the driver's like real blood. So that was also a question mark. And then
that forensic information is just somewhere, though. It's just like there's no way that we would ever be able to dig up the facts on that.
And then he also said that Diana had kept letters from Prince Philip to be revealed in the event of her death, but then the letters went missing and they never have been found.
Why would she write those?
Because I think a lot of times when
she was slightly suicidal for a bit.
I think she knew that she was going to be killed, just like JFK. I think when
So she was prepping.
I think when you are playing with when you've seen the power of these institutions and then you actively decide to go against that, you know what's at stake.
Yeah. Like the first divorce that's ever occurred in the entire British monarchy. Like, I'm willingly doing this. I'm moving on with my life. I'm remarrying someone. I'm accepting my
I'm not just
fate.
gonna go away. And that was the problem, is they thought the divorce would make her just kind of go quietly into the countryside or something, but like she became more of an icon, and it really created that dichotomy.
People were obsessed with her. Yeah.
So,
and the British monarchy couldn't have, like, the sole reason why they still exist, especially even nowadays, while they don't have any, governmental power, it's all in Parliament. They live and breathe based on people's attention, the public's attention.
Yeah.
Like, that is their real sole purpose. Yeah. So they couldn't have someone like Diana, who, even after exiting the royal family, subverting all of their attention that they want to be going towards them.
Yeah. And her interview before she died with the BBC is very telling. She reveals a lot of kind of information leading up to her death, and it's straight from the source. And she talks about definitely that.
I thought that she threw the royal family a lot of bones, actually.
She did.
She could have been a lot harsher.
Like Meghan Markle.
And even touching on things like when she was explaining her process through depression, she was saying that it was due to postpartum, postnatal depression. And I mean, you could say that maybe the bigger catalyst for her depression was her entire experience and treatment from the royal family. So that's just like a small little example of her, refraining from being as truthful as she probably could have been.
Yeah. That
would have continued to, not help the image of the royal family.
For sure. Is there anything else that we wanted to say?
I mean, the whole Diana scandal is very large.
Yeah.
And there's still information that's being dug up right now. I think since Meghan and Harry's exit, the royal family's been in our like public discourse a lot more. And like there's been scandals in that whole family for a really long time. But yeah, Diana's death was crazy. And I think that, yeah, she is a great example of someone who challenged the system that they had for so long, and just revealing to the family and revealing to the public that this new type of person in her position was actually loved even more than what they had before was, once again, like super threatening to the institution behind it, the firm, and definitely scared them. So I guess you could be a conspiracy theorist by even considering all of the other death circumstances that could have been possible, but unfortunately we're never gonna really know, so that stinks. But yeah, I'm glad we mentioned her though. I watched Spencer a couple weeks ago. Thought it was very good, but yeah, there's a lot of these adaptation films and documentaries that have information about their internal lives, but at the end of the day, they're so closed off that there's only so many realistic details that you can actually get.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think this was a really fun episode. Definitely research heavy, but I think that, I have so much respect for anyone that, is trying to be truthful, trying to do the right thing in whatever capacity they can, and is willing to put their own life on the line for calling out forces that are bigger than themselves. I mean, clearly not one person is going to be able to take down institutional power. But I think that the more that we can make people aware of this, and the more that people can realize, okay, this is really how our world works. It's not Democrat versus Republican in this just
not black and white.
It's not a micro, or it's just not this tiny world that we live in. That's just the U.S. and just these two political parties. It's the dynamics are way bigger than that. And once we can realize that, and maybe there isn't that much we can do, but at least just being aware of it, I think is good. And so yeah, I appreciate these people for allowing us to have more information and to ask questions and to be skeptical. And I'd love to do another episode like this.
I would too, because there's dozens out
so
there
many
that yeah. And even just the exercise of going back in time and, you know, uncovering all the information on the history of these events actually allows us to learn about everything that was going on in the world at that time.
But still affects us today.
Because that actually, like, honestly, that affects all of the motives. Like, you kind of have to analyze the entire economic and political landscape that was at that time, and what led the institutions to do this, or what could be their motives for a future date. Like, there's just a lot of dimensions to it. So kind of like honing in on a person and unfolding all of those other categories kind of teaches you a lot about just overall history in those periods of time. That's what I really learned and could take away from this episode and the research that we did. But yeah, I definitely would love to do another one.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you guys. Thank you for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe this video. Also, something that I wanted to bring up, Giannis Pappas, I started watching his show, but something he brings up, which I love, is he says, try to share this episode with one person that you think would enjoy the show. Because if everyone shared it with at least one person, we would double the numbers and the views, which I really like it. So I think that's a very tangible thing that would help us a lot. And stay tuned for the Kickstarter. That's another great way to support us so that we can keep doing what we're doing and even grow what we're doing. So everyone, I hope you're having a good year so far, and we'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.